Hello and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Recently, General H.R. McMaster said the U.S. military must be ready for war with China. This comes as today NATO's General Secretary Jens Stoltenberg said he's wanting stronger cooperation and more friends for NATO in the Indo-Pacific region. He said, quote, "The fact that Russia and China are coming closer and the significant investments by China and the new advanced military capabilities just underlines that China poses a threat, poses a challenge also to NATO allies. Security is not regional but global," he went on to say. "NATO needs to make sure we have friends. It is important to work more closely with our partners in the Indo-Pacific." He's specifically referring to Japan, South Korea, and Australia. So it's increasingly becoming obvious the powers that be are gearing up to send us into World War III. With so many resources being sent into Russia and the constant threat of Ukraine conflict escalating into an all-out nuclear war, you'd think these top military dogs would stop barking at China while simultaneously snarling at Russia. But nope. World wars don't happen overnight. They simmer and escalate over years. We're nearing 1 year into the war in Ukraine, and rather than escalating talks of peace, we're just seeing escalation. The tanks are on the way. Biden has announced sending longer-range missiles into the country, and there's even chatter of sending in F-16s. And if you think about it, the Russiagate narrative, which we now know was just baseless brainwashing, was probably the powers that be mentally grooming us into craving this war. Let's get real. NATO is using Ukraine as a testing ground for what war would look like between NATO allies and Russia. They're testing how well NATO weaponry holds up against Russian technology. And Russia knows this. According to antiwar.com, Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov on Tuesday said that his Egyptian counterpart delivered a message from U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken calling on Russia to stop its war in Ukraine. And Lavrov responded saying, "Russia is ready to listen to any serious proposal that is aimed at resolving the current situation in its comprehensive context." He said that the message was that Russia should stop, that Russia should quit, and then everything will be fine. He then pointed to the recent comments from NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, who called for Russia's defeat in Ukraine, and Lavrov said, quote, "Everything is quite clear here. It's not about Ukraine at all." He then said that the Kiev regime had no independence and only fulfills the will of the United States and the rest of the West, which Washington has subjugated. Now, we've never been to war with Russia. They've been on our side in both world wars. The Germans found it wasn't so easy going up against them. Russians are tough, and they've proven it through the decades. So NATO, as tough as they act, are weary about going head-to-head with Russia. And if they weren't, they would have sent in troops to help Ukraine by now, but they haven't, not directly and openly anyway. And they don't want to anger the bear too much. And quite frankly, Russia isn't too thrilled about going up against NATO either, though the fact they went into Ukraine shows they may be less afraid than we think. And maybe they're less afraid because they know they have China to back them up. After all, the two countries came out with a joint statement a year ago saying they are bonded and it can't be broken. They directly called out Western hegemony and essentially declared it's time for it to end. So now NATO is scrambling to add allies to the mix. They want allies in the Indo-Pacific, and they even threatened Turkey. Congress is currently telling Turkey they can't have our F-16s if they block Sweden and Finland's entrance into NATO. Why do warmongering members of Congress care so much about adding Sweden and Finland into NATO? Well, maybe it's because as the Hawks gear up for war, they're doing the math, and they're realizing they need more bodies. China and Russia have a near endless supply of ground troops. NATO needs more, especially if Turkey doesn't show up to the party, which it's increasingly unclear if they would. The minute war is declared, Turkey, who's been playing footsie with Russia for the past few years, just might stand NATO up. In fact, Democratic Senator Chris Van Hollen, citing Turkey's unwillingness to levy sanctions against Russia and its threats to invade North Syria, called Turkey, quote, "for the most part, not a faithful ally." Well, Turkey has the second largest ground force behind the United States and NATO. If Turkey doesn't play ball, there may be no real game. NATO is really the U.S. and the U.K. The U.K. has a navy, that's about it. France is also in the mix, but it's unclear how much or how willing they'd be in engaging in an all-out war, though they probably would out of obligation. The other nations, such as Germany, Italy, and Poland, well, they'd be providing bodies more than anything. We prevented Germany from building up a strong military for obvious reasons. So the burden of NATO falls on the U.S. and the U.K. primarily. If we have to add fighting China, the U.S. is going to be busy protecting the West Coast. Japan and South Korea are in a similar situation as Germany. They rely on us for their military protection, so what good would they be? None of this seems to faze the warmongers, and it's puzzling. Instead, the dog barks and it snarls. Pelosi went to Taiwan. McCarthy is planning his own visit. It's either they're stupid and they don't see the danger they're putting us in, or they want it and they're trying to bait it. But why? Why would they be sending us into World War III? Who benefits? Well, first of all, there obviously would be ramped up weapons manufacturing. The military-industrial complex would make gobs and gobs and gobs of money. They saw just how much money Big Pharma made during the war against COVID, and they're frothing at the mouth to make their own unprecedented billions. Politicians get elected also in times of war, so they want it. They're happy to have it. Roosevelt, I mean, look at him. He served 3 terms as president because of World War II. So every politician is on board with a war. Doesn't seem to matter if they're Republican or Democrat. But here's the real kicker of a reason. Control. Control over people and control over countries. In wartime, rights are taken away. Martial law gets implemented. You can silence opposition, you can control behavior, take over industries, make rules without having to pass laws, you can incarcerate dissidents, and you can even put people into camps. Anything is possible in a time of war. And we saw how power-hungry many of our politicians became during COVID. Imagine what sort of power they would gain during a real war with horrifying images of death and destruction. We saw the rights they took away after 9/11 with the Patriot Act. Now amplify that by 100. Control over the population to implement their Great Reset agenda and march us towards a global governance would be inevitable. They want to control us as people and entire nations too. In the past, the wars with Germany and Japan, guess what happened to them? They lose, U.S. gains control of them like vassal states. So they're hoping for that same outcome with Russia and China, right? They're hoping we go to war, Russia and China lose. What happens? They come under the control of the United States. They come under the control of the West. The Great Reset, the global governance, all of that starts to come into play because now, as Biden puts it, he's going up. The world is autocrats versus democracies, dictators versus democracies. He's putting the world's countries against one another. So if the democracy wins and is able to take over all of these dictators and rule the world, well, then the Great Reset, the World Economic Forum, their entire vision for the world, all of that comes into play. The United States gets to control the world in that scenario. And that is really what they're frothing at the mouth over. They want that. They want to be able to control the people and they want to be able to control countries. They know that if they implement certain rules in martial law during wartime, that we'll never get those rights back. They can fundamentally change the way our society behaves. They can fundamentally change the way the world works if they win. But the big question is, what happens if we lose? That's the big question. Well, I'm excited to tell you about a new product I've been trying out that makes eating healthy so much easier. Field of Greens. It's a powder mix of real, freeze-dried, organic fruits and vegetables that you can mix into a drink or sprinkle onto food. It's a great way to make sure you're getting enough of the vitamins and minerals you need without having to buy and prepare a ton of produce. I put mine in my morning chocolate protein shake, and it kind of gives it a fruity, chocolatey taste. Plus, it helps me feel less hungry in between meals because my body's getting all the nutrition it needs. So don't miss out on Field of Greens. Head over to fieldofgreens.com and use the promo code KIM to get 15% off your first order, even though they have quality ingredients. And yeah, it might cost a little bit more initially, but it ends up being cheaper than buying a lot of individual produce items at the grocery store. So don't miss out on this opportunity to save on your first order, 15% off with the promo code KIM. Just head over to fieldofgreens.com.